wife said those words on the same day we buried my father. We had just come home from the cemetery. My dress shoes were still muddy. I hadn't even changed my tie yet. The house smelled like casserole and sympathy cards, and I was standing in the kitchen holding the one thing my father had pressed into my hands before they closed the casket, an envelope. Inside was an old savings passbook, the kind with a dark blue cover and handwritten entries, the kind banks stopped issuing 30 years ago. My wife looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. "That's it," she said. "After everything, that's what he left you." I didn't answer. I was still reading the handwriting on the cover, my father's handwriting. The letters were shaky near the end, the way his hands had gotten. She took it from me, turned it over once, and set it down on the counter like it was a piece of junk mail. "It's probably nothing," she said. "Old account. Closed years ago. You should just throw it away." I picked it back up without saying anything. She sighed, that particular sigh she had, the one that meant she thought I was being sentimental and foolish, and walked out of the kitchen. I sat down at that kitchen table for a long time after everyone left. My son called from Portland to check on me, and I told him I was fine, which was a lie, but the kind of lie you tell because the truth is too large to say out loud over the phone. My daughter-in-law sent flowers. The neighbors brought a pie. By 8 o'clock, the house was quiet, in the way that a house gets quiet after something permanent has happened. I set the passbook on the nightstand. I didn't throw it away. My father's name was Alton Cruz. He was 79 years old when he died, and he had lived in the same house in Decatur, Georgia for 41 years. He raised me and my younger sister in that house after our mother passed. He worked at the rail yard for 32 years and never once complained about it, at least not to me. He drove the same truck from 1987 until the engine finally gave out in 2019, and then he drove a used Buick he bought for cash at a dealership in Marietta. He was not a complicated man. Or so I thought. The trouble between us had started years earlier, not because of anything dramatic, not because of a single fight or a broken promise, but because of my wife. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's the truth, and I've had enough time now to look at it clearly. She had never warmed to my father. She found him too quiet, too stubborn, too set in his ways. He found her too loud, too focused on appearances, too quick to spend what hadn't been earned yet. They were polite to each other for about 5 years, and then they stopped even being that. After a while, visits got shorter, then they stopped altogether. I told myself it was distance. Decatur was 4 hours from where we lived in Raleigh, but that wasn't really it. My wife made it clear, in the way she had of making things clear, without ever quite saying them directly, that she didn't want to spend her weekends at my father's house, and I, God help me, went along with that. For about 8 years I saw my father maybe twice a year, Thanksgiving every other year, and once in the summer if I drove down alone, which I did sometimes when she was visiting her brother in Charleston. I am not proud of this. I want to say that plainly. When he got sick, congestive heart failure, slow and grinding, I started going more often. The last 2 years, I went every 6 weeks or so. My wife didn't come, but she didn't stop me either, and I told myself that was enough. It wasn't. But I told myself it was. He didn't talk much about money. My father was the kind of man who thought it was bad manners to discuss finances, the same way he thought it was bad manners to ask someone what they paid for their car. He had a small pension from the rail yard. He had Social Security. He had the house, which he owned free and clear. I assumed that was the shape of his life, financially, and I never pushed him on it because he never invited me to. The last time I saw him conscious, he was sitting up in the hospital bed they'd brought into the front bedroom. He took my hand and held it for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "I left something for you in the desk. Don't let anyone talk you out of doing something about it." I thought he was rambling. His medication made him foggy toward the end. I squeezed his hand and said I understood, even though I wasn't sure I did. He died 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning in March, with my sister on one side of the bed and a hospice nurse on the other. I was on the road, an hour away. I didn't make it in time. That's another thing I'll carry. The envelope was in the top drawer of his old roll-top desk, exactly where he said it would be. My sister found it when we were going through his things the day after the funeral and handed it to me without opening it. My name was written on the outside in his handwriting. Inside was the passbook. My wife had gone to bed by the time I finally looked at it closely that night. I sat in the armchair in the living room with just the lamp on, and I turned the pages carefully, the way you handle something old and possibly important. The account had been opened in 1987. The bank was listed as First Covenant Savings, which I had never heard of. The early entries showed small deposits, $40 here, $60 there, made once or twice a month in what looked like cash. Working man's savings. Nothing that would catch her attention. But I kept flipping. The deposits got larger in the mid-90s, then larger still. By 2003, there were entries showing deposits of $300 and $400 at a time, sometimes more. The passbook ran out of pages in 2008, and someone, my father I assumed, had written a note on the inside back cover in pencil, continued a new book. See safety deposit box. I stared at that for a long time. Safety deposit box. I had no idea my father had a safety deposit box. I had no idea he'd had an active savings account at all, let alone one that went back 35 years. I sat there in that armchair until almost 1 in the morning, thinking about what he might have meant. Thinking about what he'd said in the hospital. Don't let anyone talk you out of doing something about it. I thought about my wife's face when she set the passbook on the counter. Just throw it away. I went to bed without saying anything to her. But I did not throw it away. First Covenant Savings turned out to still exist, though it had been acquired twice and was now operating as Meridian Community Bank. There was a branch in Decatur, about 2 miles from my father's house. I drove down the following Saturday, alone. I told my wife I was going to handle some paperwork with the estate attorney, which was true. I did have an appointment with the attorney that morning. I just didn't mention the bank. I don't know exactly why I didn't tell her. Maybe I was protecting the moment. Maybe I already knew, on some level, that whatever was in that passbook was something she would want to get her hands on quickly, and I wanted to understand it myself first. Maybe I was remembering my father's voice. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. The branch manager's name was Theodore, mid-40s, gray at the temples, the kind of careful Midwestern manner that makes you trust a person instinctively. I explained who I was, showed him the passbook and the death certificate and the letter from the estate attorney naming me as executor. He looked at everything slowly and then looked up at me. "Mr. Cruz," he said, "can you give me just a few minutes?" He excused himself and went into the back office. He was gone for almost 10 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying a folder, and his expression had shifted in a way I couldn't quite read. "Would you mind coming with me?" he said. We went to a private room, one of those small conference rooms that banks have for conversations they don't want happening in the lobby. He closed the door and sat across from me. He set the folder on the table, but didn't open it right away. "Mr. Cruz," he said, "I want to make sure I'm understanding the situation correctly, so I'm going to ask you a direct question. Were you aware of the full scope of your father's account history with this institution?" "No," I said. "I didn't even know this account existed until last week." He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something. "I think," he said, "you should probably sit down for this." And then he caught himself, because I was already sitting, and something almost like a small smile crossed his face. "What I mean is, take a moment before I tell you what I'm looking at." I told him to go ahead. He opened the folder. Alton Cruz had been quietly saving money since 1987. The original account had rolled over into a long-term savings account, then a CD ladder, then a mix of low-risk investments managed through the bank's trust services division, something the bank had offered to preferred long-term customers starting in the late 90s. My father, apparently, had been considered a preferred long-term customer. The combined value of the accounts, the original savings, the CDs that had matured and rolled over, and the investment portfolio was just over $412,000. I asked Theodore to repeat the number. He did. I sat there and I looked at the wall behind him for what felt like a very long time. $412,000. My father. The man who drove a truck until it died. The man who bought his suits at Belk. The man who reused aluminum foil and kept a garden in the backyard to save money on tomatoes. He had been building this, quietly and carefully, for 35 years, and he had never said a word about it to anyone, not to me, not to my sister as far as I knew, not to a soul. "There's something else," Theodore said. He slid a second document across the table. It was a record of withdrawal activity from the past 6 years. My stomach dropped before I even started reading. It had started with a power of attorney. My father had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia in 2018, something I had known, something I had been told about, though he'd made light of it, and I hadn't fully grasped how serious it was. Sometime in early 2019, a document had been filed with the bank granting power of attorney over his financial accounts to 2 individuals, my sister's husband, a man I'll call my brother-in-law, and my sister herself. I had not known about this. Over the following 4 years, between 2019 and 2023, a total of approximately $87,000 have been withdrawn from my father's accounts in increments. Some were described as home care expenses, some were described as medical supplies. One was described almost insultingly as property maintenance. The house had not been maintained. I had seen that with my own eyes every time I visited. There were also several larger withdrawals, $10,000 here, $12,000 there, with no description at all. Theodore had flagged the account internally 8 months earlier, after a routine audit identified patterns consistent with elder financial abuse. At that point, he had contacted Adult Protective Services, and an investigation had been opened. But my father was still alive then, still technically under the legal protection of the power of attorney, and the process had moved slowly. Now that he was gone, and now that I presented as executor of the estate with proper documentation, Theodore had been waiting for exactly this conversation. "I want to be clear," he said carefully, "that the bank is not in a position to make legal determinations, but I've been instructed by our compliance department to provide you with this complete record, and to strongly encourage you to take it to law enforcement and to your estate attorney today." I looked at the numbers on that page for a long time. $87,000. My brother-in-law had taken $87,000 from an old man with dementia who trusted him. My sister, I still don't fully understand her role, whether she knew everything or only part of it, whether she was a willing participant or someone who had been manipulated herself, had signed the documents. I thought about my father in that hospital bed, pressing my hand. Don't let anyone talk you out of doing something about it. He had known, or he had suspected, and he hadn't told me directly, because maybe he didn't fully trust that I would act, not with my wife's influence, not with how distant I'd allowed myself to become. So he had left the passbook where he knew I would find it, and he had planted those words in my ear, and he had trusted that I would do the right thing eventually. I excused myself to use the restroom, and I stood over the sink with the cold water running, and I cried. Not a little, a lot. The ugly kind of crying that you're glad no one can see. Then I washed my face, straightened my collar, and went back to the table. I did not go home that night. I called my son from the parking lot of the bank. He was the one person I trusted completely in that moment. My son from my first marriage, the one who had sent flowers, the one who called every week, the one whose relationship with my father had stayed warm even when mine had frayed. I told him everything. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Dad, you have to report this today." I did. I went to the estate attorney's office that afternoon. I told him what I had found. By 4 o'clock, we had filed a report with the Decatur Police Department and submitted a formal complaint to Georgia's Adult Protective Services Unit, which elevated it to the state's Elder Financial Exploitation Task Force because of the amount involved. My brother-in-law was arrested 8 weeks later. He was charged with exploitation of a disabled adult, a felony under Georgia law, along with 4 counts of theft by taking. My sister was charged as a co-conspirator, but agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a plea arrangement. The investigation also turned up an additional $11,000 that had been siphoned through a joint credit card that my brother-in-law had opened in my father's name without his knowledge. He was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 6 years in state prison, with 3 years to serve and 3 years of supervised probation. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, described what he had done as a profound betrayal of a vulnerable man who had done nothing but trust him. Yes, that's exactly what it was. The estate took some time to settle. There were legal fees, and the recovery of the stolen funds through civil restitution was only partial. Some of the money had been spent in ways that were difficult to trace. In the end, the estate distributed approximately $390,000 between me and my sister, minus costs. My sister's share was subject to offset for restitution, and I won't pretend that the relationship between us is what it once was. I don't know that it will ever be fully what it once was. We talk, but carefully, like people talking around something large and fragile that neither of us wants to knock over. My wife had a great deal to say when she found out about the money. She had plenty of ideas about how it should be handled, plenty of enthusiasm that had not been present when she was telling me to throw the passbook away. I listened to what she said, and then I made my own decisions about it, with the help of a financial advisor and my son. And I did not apologize for that. I'm not going to speak in detail about what's happened to my marriage since then. That's a longer story, and some of it is still unfolding. I will say only that when someone reveals the limits of what they value in a moment of grief, you don't forget it. You carry it with you, and it changes the way you see certain mornings. What I keep coming back to is my father's patience. He was a man who never wasted words. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And when he pressed that envelope into my hands, he was trusting me to be the person he had raised, not the person I had sometimes been in between. I think about him driving that old truck, saving $40, at a time when $40 cost him something. Never spending money to impress anyone, never buying things to fill a space inside himself, the way so many people do. Just quietly, deliberately, putting it away. For what? For me, it turns out, for a future he wouldn't be alive to see. That is a kind of love I didn't fully understand until I sat in that conference room at Meridian Community Bank and watched a number appear on a piece of paper. I've done some things with the money that I think he would approve of. I've paid off my son's student loans, something my son cried about when I told him, a reaction that reminded me oddly of my father, who also cried at unexpected moments and was never ashamed of it. I've set aside money for my grandchildren's education. I donated to the Decatur YMCA, while my father had taken me to swim on Saturday mornings when I was 7 years old and where he had been a member for 50 years. I kept the passbook. It sits on the shelf in my office now, next to a photograph of my father standing in front of the truck. He's squinting into the sun and almost smiling, the way he always almost smiled when he was actually happy. I look at it sometimes and I think he knew. He knew the whole time. Not just about the money. About everything. About what mattered and what didn't. About what endures. He just never said it directly, because he was Alton Cruz, and Alton Cruz believed you showed people things instead of telling them. He showed me. It just took me longer than I would like to admit to finally see it.